I am the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I'm going to talk about Parmenides and his work on nature. You know how some people are so important that the entire calendar is separated into two epochs based on his birth? Philosophy has several such personalities too, the very first being Socrates. Socrates' life and thought is such a landmark in ancient Western philosophy that thinkers are placed in the chronology as before or after him, or at least in reference to him. Parmenides was born around 515 BC, predating Socrates by some 36 years. He is considered among the most important of the pre-Socratic philosophers. Plato felt such a need to respond to Parmenides that he wrote an entire dialogue featuring the man, while nearer our time, Martin Heidegger cites Parmenides as an influence. Referring to the ancient Greek philosophers, Gerd Van Riel writes that all later philosophers will have to cope with the logic and conclusions of Parmenides. Most of Parmenides' writing has been lost, though we still have 154 lines of his poetical work on nature. Like many of the thinkers in those early days of philosophy, he tries to understand nature, that is, the world around them. So on nature is a common title for philosophical works. Indeed, in this work, Parmenides is responding to what has come before him, such as the literary and mythical tradition. Parmenides' On Nature was written in verse, which was the norm then. Writing and reading were still rare abilities 2,500 years ago. Literature and knowledge were mostly transmitted orally, which means that if one wanted to inform others of a text, they had to memorize it and then recite it back. This explains why ancient Greek poets such as Homer and Hesiod also wrote in verse. The form of poetry and its strict meter made memorizing texts easier, which explains why many find it easy to remember lyrics of pop songs, while they have greater difficulty remembering a prose text word for word. Prose just isn't as catchy. Writing in verse was just one of the legacies Parmenides inherited. Prior to the start of philosophy proper, the ancient people's understanding of themselves and the world was dominated by myth. Explanations of worldly phenomena were made in reference to gods. For instance, the seasons changed because Persephone, the daughter of Demeter, who is the goddess of agriculture, was kidnapped by Hades, the god of the underworld. Persephone subsequently spends half a year with Demeter, a time when nature would flourish, and the other half with Hades, when nature would wane. The beginnings of philosophy was not, however, so much to escape myth and gods, but to try to reason through them or alongside them. We see this in Parmenides, whose work on nature is rich with mythological figures, and where he speaks with a goddess who unveils truth and opinion to him. As Aristotle would later say, even the lover of myth is in a sense a lover of wisdom, for the myth is composed of wonders. Parmenides is also responding to other pre-Socratic philosophers, specifically Heraclitus, who would have been at the peak of his powers when Parmenides was still a young man. Heraclitus is best known today for the concept of pantarai, that everything is in a state of permanent flux or change. According to him, you cannot possibly step into the same river twice, because the waters you touched the first time would have already moved on by the second time you step into the river. Parmenides reacts against this notion of constant change, since if everything is continuously changing, we can never know anything, that is, we cannot possibly have any knowledge. Having now laid out some of Parmenides' precursors, it is time to delve into his poem itself. The poem has two parts, the way of truth and the way of opinion. We owe the survival of his text to Simplicius, who lived about 1,000 years later. Simplicius cites the first half of the poem, The Way of Truth, in his own writing, because the text was in his time already difficult to find, and he wanted to save it from oblivion. The second half, The Way of Opinion, Simplicius did not think was so worth preserving, which as a result is almost entirely lost. Parmenides is the main character in his poem, which begins dramatically with him on a horse-drawn chariot, racing towards a temple. Fragment 1. The steeds that carry me took me as far as my heart could desire, when once they had brought me and set me on the renowned way of the goddess, who leads the man who knows through every town. On that way was I conveyed, for on it did the wise steeds convey me, drawing my chariot, and maidens led the way. And the axle blazing in the socket, For it was urged round by well-turned wheels at each end, was making the holes in the naves sing, while the daughters of the sun, hasting to convey me into the light, threw back the veils from off their faces and left the abbot of night. Picture how pitch black the night must be of an ancient forest. The quiet of their old woods is broken by a carriage driven by a fleet of powerful horses. The sensation of speed is depicted with the carriage's axles spinning so rapidly that it is sparking, and the air whipping past was so rapid that the carriage emitted a high-pitched sound that sounded like a person singing. Parmenides is escorted by the daughters of the sun, who are rushing to bring him from out of the darkness into the light of the temple, literally and metaphorically into the light of knowledge. Fragment 1 continues. There are the gates of the ways of night and day, fitted above with a lintel and below with a threshold of stone. They themselves, high in the air, are closed by mighty doors, and avenging justice controls the double bolts. Her did the maidens entreat with gentle words and cunningly persuade to unfasten without demur the bolted bar from the gates. Then when the doors were thrown back, they disclosed the wide opening, when their brazen posts, fitted with rivets and nails, swung in turn on their hinges. Straight through them on the broad way did the maidens guide the horses and the car. Parmenides arrives at the temple gates. The massive and grand gates are firmly shut with double bolts. Not just anyone may enter. The goddess of justice decides who may pass, and the daughters of the sun must plead Parmenides' case for him to be allowed in. The driveway towards the temple is a wide one. This could possibly depict that the path to knowledge and wisdom is a broad path where there are many routes to take, or simply the splendor of the temple of wisdom with its vast and magnificent treasures of knowledge. Fragment 1 continues. And the goddess greeted me kindly, and took my right hand in hers, and spoke to me these words. Welcome, O youth, that come to my abbot on the car that bears thee, tended by immortal charioteers. It is no ill chance, but right and justice, that has sent thee forth to travel on this way. Far indeed does it lie from the beaten track of men. Parmenides meets the goddess who takes him by the hand. She tells him that it is not by luck that he has come to the temple, but it is correct and just that he has come. The place is away from where people would normally venture, but it is suitable for someone like Parmenides, who is a righteous and just person. To seek knowledge and wisdom is not what most people will and can do, but Parmenides is suited for it by his virtues of righteousness and justice. Because of his virtues, he is permitted to enter by the goddess of justice, who is gatekeeper of the temple. Not everyone can even find this temple. Parmenides had to be escorted by the daughters of the sun, the offsprings of the god who shines the light that illuminates the world. He has to be brought to the temple by the right people, by those who love the light of knowledge also. Fragment 1 continues. Mean it that thou should learn all things, as well the unshaken heart of well-rounded truth, as the opinions of mortals in which is no true belief at all. Yet nonetheless shalt thou learn these things also, how the things that seem, as they all pass through everything, must gain the semblance of being. Here at the temple, Parmenides shall learn both truth and the opinion of men, which is untruth. Why should one be taught and learn untruth? So they can understand how things which appear to us seem to be what is real, though it is not. Fragment 1 is a preamble to the philosophy proper, which will be found in fragments 2 to 8. Fragment 2 and 3. Come now, and I will tell thee, and do thou hearken, and carry my word away. The only ways of enquiry that can be thought of, the one way that it is, and cannot not be, is the path of persuasion, for it attends upon truth. That it is not, and needs must not be, that I tell thee is a path altogether unthinkable. For thou could not know that which is not, that is impossible, nor utter it, for the same thing can be taught as can be. Parmenides is to listen and to transmit what the goddess teaches him. There are only two ways we can think about things, a correct and a wrong way. The correct way of thinking is that what is, and cannot not be. That is, things that do exist do and must exist. What exists is in existence the way that it is and cannot not exist. We are convinced at its existence, and hence the truth of the statement that what is and cannot not be. At least the first part of the statement on existence is analytically true. That is, it is a tautology. What exists is in existence. How can we think of the necessity, though, of what exists? If we accept that what exists is in existence, then it cannot be its own contradiction, that what exists does not exist. A thing that exists cannot be otherwise than be in existence. Hence it must necessarily be in existence. The corollary follows, and hence is also analytically true. What is not, that is, what does not exist, and it must necessarily not exist. A reasonable person is unable to even think of a non-existent thing, because it is not possible to know what is not in existence, and hence to speak about it. What can be taught can exist. Fragment 5. It is all one to me where I begin, for I shall come back there again in time. Regardless of which step we begin with in our reasoning process, we will complete the full circuit of our reasoning if we arrive at the truth. Hence it is not so important where we begin, but perhaps instead we should begin to reason. Fragment 6. That which can be spoken and taught must be, for it is possible for it, but not for nothing to be. That is what I bid thee ponder. This is the first way of inquiry from which I hold thee back, and then from that way also on which mortals wander knowing nothing, two-headed. For helplessness guides the wandering thought in their breasts. They are carried along, deaf and blind at once, altogether dazed, hordes devoid of judgment, who are persuaded that to be and to be not are the same, yet not the same, and for whom the path of all things is backward turning. What can be said and taught of necessarily must exist. What, however, is nothing, is non-existent, cannot exist. We need to refrain from talking and thinking about what does not exist, to refrain from talking and thinking about nothing. The goddess gives an image of ignorant people walking around in a confused and helpless way, as if they have two heads or are blind and deaf, unable to judge what is real and what is not, who think that things that exist and do not exist are the same and yet different. Instead of being able to get closer to the truth, they are getting further away. Fragment 7. For never shall this be proved, that things that are not are. But do thou hold back thy thought from this way of inquiry, nor let custom, born of much experience, force thee to let wander along this road thy aimless eye, thy echoing ear, or thy tongue. But do thou judge by reason the strife-encompassed proof that I have spoken. We are unable to prove that what does not exist in fact exists. However, conventions or norms, which may be born from people's collective experience, might tell us otherwise. We need to use our reason to judge the various arguments which might conflict with our conventional understanding. We should rely on logical, well-reasoned proofs and not arguments differing to norms and conventions to judge what is correct, to judge what is the truth. Fragment 8. One way only is left to be spoken of, that it is. And on this way are full many signs that what is uncreated and imperishable, for it is entire, immovable, and without end. It was not in the past, nor shall it be, since it is now, all at once, one, continuous. For what creation wilt thou seek for it? How and whence did it grow? Nor shall I allow thee to say or to think, from that which is not, for it is not to be said or thought that it is not. And what need would have driven it on to grow, starting from nothing, at a later time rather than an earlier? Thus it must either completely be or be not. Nor would the force of true belief allow that besides what is, there could also arise anything from what is not. Wherefore justice loses not her fetters to allow it to come into being or perish, but hold it fast, and the decision on these matters rests here. It is or it is not. But it has surely been decided, as it must be, to leave alone the one way as unthinkable and nameless, for it is no true way, and that the other is real and true. How could what is thereafter perish? And how could it come into being? For if it came into being, it is not, nor if it is going to be in the future. So coming into being is extinguished and perishing unimaginable. Parmenides deduces the following from the tautologies he has laid out of how what is and must be, and what is not and must not exist. What exists is not created, and it cannot be destroyed because it is complete, without motion, and cannot come to an end in time. It is not something that only exists in the past, nor is it something that comes into being in the future, but it has always existed, has continued to exist, and will continue to exist. To ask where it comes from, how it was created, and how it will develop are invalid questions. It cannot possibly come from what previously did not already exist, because what exists, exists. It cannot not have existed, and besides, since we cannot even conceive the non-existent, it would not have been possible to speak of the non-existent. Even if we allow that things can just come into existence at a particular time, why that time instead of any other time? Hence, either what exists must completely exist or not exist at all. To Parmenides, there is no middle ground. What to Parmenides is justice is that things exist as they are. Fragment 8 continues. Nor is it divisible, since it is all alike. Nor is there more here and less there, which would prevent it from cleaving together, but it is all full of what is. So it is all continuous, for what is clings close to what is. But motionless within the limits of mighty bonds, it is without beginning or end, since coming into being and perishing has been driven far away, cast out by true belief. Abiding the same in the same place, it rests by itself, and so abides firm where it is. For strong necessity holds it firm within the bonds of the limit that keeps it back on every side, because it is not lawful that what is should be unlimited. For it is not in need. If it were, it would need all. What can be taught is only the thought that it is. For you will not find thought without what is, in relation to which it is uttered. For there is not, nor shall be, anything else besides what is, since fate fettered it to be entire and immovable. Wherefore all these are mere names, which mortals laid down believing them to be true, coming to being and perishing, being and not being, that is both at once, change of place and variation of bright colour. But since there is a furthest limit, it is bounded on every side like the bulk of a well-rounded sphere, from the centre equally balanced in every direction, for it needs must not be somewhat more here and somewhat less there. For neither is there that which is not, which might stop it from meeting its like, nor can what is be more here and less there than what is, since it is all inviolate. For being equal to itself on every side, it rests uniformly within its limits. If you think up to this point that his theory is odd, though hard to refute, Parmenides goes even further. Because it is complete, what exists cannot be divided into parts. It must be homogeneous in content and evenly distributed in space. What exists within a limit in space. It cannot extend infinitely because it is complete. It has no need of anything else, for indeed nothing else exists. Because it is limited in space and yet has to be homogeneous and evenly distributed in space, all that exists is a sphere so that it is equally distributed in every direction and is in a state of rest. There is also no motion within it, since if there is motion, it would then not be homogeneous and evenly distributed. Up to this point of time, the concept of empty space or the void is not yet conceived. That would have to wait for the atomists like Democritus to conceptualize. Following his logic, we should be able to only think of what exists. However, people seem to think that there are things that come into existence and go away, that there are changes, that there are shades of light and colour. Parmenides calls all these mere names, which are the way of opinion and not the truth. Fragment 8 continues. Here I end my trustworthy discourse and thought concerning truth. Henceforth, learn the beliefs of mortal men, listening to the deceitful ordering of my words. For they made up their minds to name two forms, of which they must not name one only. That is, where they have gone astray, and distinguish them as opposite in appearance, and assign to them manifestations different from the other. To one, the ethereal flame of fire, gentle and very light, in every direction identical with itself, but not with the other. And that other too is in itself just the opposite, dark night, dense in appearance and heavy. The whole ordering of these I tell thee, as it seems likely, that so no thought of mortal man shall ever outstrip thee. Parmenides prepares to go into the second half of his essay, where the goddess is going to tell him about the way of opinion of mere mortals. They have divided the world into what exists and what does not exist. What exists is characterized by brightness and being light in weight, while what does not exist is dark, dense, and heavy. The goddess gives Parmenides an account of the opinions of men, which is what the goddess presents in the second part. The goddess will give Parmenides an account of the opinions of men, so that he will not be caught unaware by them. What fragments remain of this second part of the way of opinion is fragmentary indeed, some just incomplete parts of sentences. I've explained the text fragment by fragment, but now I'm going to shift to commenting on the text as a whole. Contemporary readers may notice that despite his poem's title on nature, Parmenides was not quite dealing with nature, since he distrusts what our senses tell us. Instead, he is presenting an ontology, that is, a theory of reality, that he figured out using just his reason, and this ontology is vastly different from the sensible world that we perceive. Parmenides has termed this ontology nature, or physis in Greek, but what he is talking about is what later thinkers would call metaphysics, which means beyond physis or beyond nature. However, to say that he is doing metaphysics is anachronistic, since such a term has not yet been conceived in his time, given that the state of knowledge and discourse has not yet reached a stage to consider and critique the practices of the study of nature done by the thinkers then. In that way, Parmenides is ahead of his time, and might even be considered the father of metaphysics, since he is considering the nature of existence itself, of being qua being. He also reasons using logical deductive a priori arguments in a then rather novel way, predating the formalization of syllogistic logic by Aristotle by more than 150 years. The way of truth in Parmenides' On Nature has three parts. 1. The preamble. 2. The tautological proposition of what is. And 3. Resulting from this proposition, we arrive at an uncreated, indestructible, complete, unchanging, motionless, eternal spherical reality. The preamble comprises vivid images filled with mythical elements, graphically evoking in its readers the difficulty of seeking truth. Such knowledge and wisdom are not available to everyone, but is reserved for only the just and the righteous. The goddess then presents a tautology, which grounds Parmenides' logical argument. What is. Because what is, and cannot not be, it must necessarily be. That is, it must necessarily exist. The corollary is that what is not, and must necessarily not be. That is, what does not exist has no existence and necessarily has no existence. However, the next step may strike modern readers as odd. He claims that we cannot think of what does not exist because we cannot have knowledge of what does not exist. However, we are all quite familiar with imagining things that do not exist, such as unicorns. Indeed, Parmenides is right that we cannot have knowledge of unicorns in the sense that we cannot have justified true beliefs of the nature of a unicorn, since it does not exist. But that does not mean we cannot speak or think about unicorns at all as a fictitious object. There are at least two ways we can consider why Parmenides wrote as such. Firstly, he might be referring to an idealized person who reasons perfectly, and such a thinker will not think of non-existent things, since it will be unreasonable to do so. Parmenides does recognize that actual people are not like that, since he talks about how mortals are confused and two-headed in fragment 6. Indeed, since we arguably do not have two-headed human beings in reality, how then can Parmenides even think of such a creature? Hence, Parmenides is referring to an ideal person and not actual mortals. Another way to look at this is that he is writing according to the rules of ancient Greek poetry with its strict length per verse and meter. Hence, to accommodate those rules, he might have to modify his thought to fit, hence leaving out some words and nuances. We can only speculate if that is the case, since such knowledge is lost to time. Parmenides derives from his logical arguments a monistic reality, which is startling considering how counterintuitive it must have been and still is, since our experience of the world is so different from an uncreated, indestructible, complete, unchanging, motionless, eternal sphere. Later pre-Socratic thinkers would challenge his monism with a pluralism to account for the underlying ontology of our reality, but they will have to answer to his logic. They will have to further develop the concepts of non-existence and nothingness, in addition to furthering our notions of what being is. Parmenides himself does not use the substantive term being, or even the infinitive form of the verb to be, instead writing about what is, without referring to any explicit object. In fact, he does not think of what exists as an abstract entity such as being, but is discussing what is and what is not in material terms. He literally means that what is physically exists. The immaterial as a concept only begins with Plato. Being as an abstract notion also only comes later, perhaps first in Plato and then in Aristotle, who calls metaphysics the study of being qua being. Fast forwarding from ancient thinkers to pick just one modern philosopher that has been deeply influenced by Parmenides. Heidegger in Being and Time named the pre-Socratics, Parmenides specifically, as the ones genuinely inquiring on the nature of being in a way that has not since been surpassed. He criticizes later philosophy for having abandoned the study of being, presupposing or ignoring it when in fact the nature of being is the fundamental question of metaphysics. He would try to understand the nature of being, specifically human being or Dasein, making moves not so different, though far more comprehensive than what Parmenides has done. His work is just one among many instances where Parmenides' ontological challenge continues to impact philosophy. Thank you. If you wish to support the Philosophical Bachelor, you can do so at worldwideweb.patreon.com/philosophicalbachelor.